The medieval world was far more interconnected than many imagine. Beyond the castles of Europe and the caravans of Arabia, there stretched a network of seas, deserts, and ports that carried not only goods, but also ideas, cultures, and ambitions. Among the most remarkable of these encounters was the meeting of China and Africa's story of ships that crossed oceans, of merchants and emperors, of gold and porcelain, and of a vision that sought to bring distant continents into dialogue centuries before the age of European empires. In the early 15th century, the Ming dynasty of China had risen to power, eager to reassert its influence after the Mongol era. The Yongle emperor, a man of immense ambition, sought to display the wealth and grandeur of his empire to the known world. He turned to one of his most trusted servants, Admiral Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch of Hui descent. Zheng He would become the leader of an unprecedented fleet of shipster so-called treasure voyagers. These were no ordinary vessels. At their heart were the colossal treasure ships, some said to be over 120 meters long, dwarfing the caravels and cogs of Europe. They were floating cities, carrying thousands of sailors, soldiers, merchants, and interpreters. Their decks were lined with silk, porcelain, lacquerware, and coins of copper and silver. These were not warships, they were statements of prestige, meant to awe all who beheld them. From 1405 to 1433, Zheng He commanded 7 great voyages across the seas. They traveled through the South China Sea, across the Indian Ocean, and along the coasts of Arabia and Africa. The chronicles record the names of ports that glittered in the medieval imagination: Calicut in India, Hormuz in Persia, Aden at the mouth of the Red Sea, and far to the west, the ports of East Africa, Mogadishu, Malindi, and Mombasa. Here, Chinese sailors stepped onto African soil, their arrival marked by wonder and curiosity. The African coast was no stranger to trade. Arab and Persian merchants had long plied these waters, linking the Swahili coast to the wider Islamic world. But the arrival of the Chinese fleet was something else entirely. It was a state mission on a scale few could rival. The records describe these meetings in respectful detail. In Mogadishu, the Chinese were greeted by sultans who ruled bustling cities of coralstone mosques, carved wooden doors, and markets heavy with ivory, gold, and spices. In Malindi, they found an eager ally, a kingdom that would later gift Zheng He a giraffe, creature that caused such astonishment in the Ming court that scholars described it as a mythical beast symbolizing peace and prosperity. The animal was paraded before the emperor as proof that the farthest reaches of the earth acknowledged his mandate of heaven. This was not just an exchange of exotic animals. It was a moment of genuine encounter. African merchants showed the Chinese ivory tusks, ambergris, and leopard skins. In return, the Chinese offered silks, glazed ceramics, and finely worked metal. Archaeologists have found traces of these encounters. Shards of Chinese porcelain in Kilwa and Zanzibar, treasured heirlooms passed down for generations. Evidence of a world where oceans carried culture as much as commerce. But the story was more than trade, and tribute was a political gesture. Zheng He's voyagers sought to weave distant rulers into the Ming tribute system, a network in which foreign kings acknowledged the supremacy of the Chinese emperor in exchange for gifts and recognition. For the African rulers, this was less about subservience and more about securing powerful allies and luxurious goods. Yet in the Ming imagination, it was proof that the world bent toward China, that heaven's mandate extended from the East China Sea to the shores of Africa. Still, these encounters were fleeting. The voyages ended in 1433. After the death of the Yongle Emperor and his successors shift toward internal concerns. The massive ships were left to rot, the shipyards abandoned, and the maps of faraway lands forgotten. China turned inward, while Africa's Swahili coast continued its role as a crossroads of trade soon to be reshaped by the arrival of Portuguese caravels at the end of the 15th century. The brief encounter between China and Africa faded into memory, recorded in a handful of inscriptions, chronicles, and artifacts. The legacy, however, lingers. The voyages of Zhang He remind us that the medieval world was not a closed, static place, but a web of connections where African sultans and Chinese emperors could stand as distant partners in a global drama. They show us that centuries before the Atlantic slave trade or the rise of European colonialism, oceans were already highways of dialogue between civilizations. The giraffe brought to Nanjing, described as a mythical beast, is more than a curiosity, is a symbol of how the unfamiliar could be transformed into the marvelous, how cultural exchange could reshape the very imagination of a people today. In an age where China once again seeks ties with Africa through trade and infrastructure, the memory of those first encounters carries resonance. They speak of a time when diplomacy was carried on the winds of the monsoon, when the Indian Ocean bound continents together, and when a single fleet could embody the grandeur of an empire. As we reflect on this history, we are reminded that the past is not distant. It echoes in the choices nations make today, in the ties they seek to renew, and in the stories we continue to tell of encounters across seas. This episode was created with careful research and passion for uncovering the threads of human history. If you believe in supporting high-quality historical storytelling, consider lending your support. It allows us to keep bringing the forgotten voices of the past to life, so that history remains a living dialogue for the present.